Catherine Ferguson was born into circumstances that should have erased her from history entirely. Sometime around 79, perhaps a few years earlier, a woman named Katy Williams gave birth to a daughter while being transported by ship from Virginia to New York City. The mother was enslaved, and she was being moved, likely sold, to a new owner in the north. The baby girl arrived in the world on the open water, somewhere between two coastlines, belonging to neither place but already claimed as property. To understand Catherine Ferguson's life, we must first understand the world into which she was born. In the late 18th century, New York was a city in transition. The Revolutionary War had devastated the area, leaving it a ravaged and partially destroyed seaport town. But it was rebuilding rapidly, and its population was expanding. It was also, crucially, a slaveholding city. While New York is often associated with Northern abolitionism, the reality was more complicated. Enslaved people made up a significant portion of the city's population, working as domestic servants, skilled laborers, and dock workers. The contradiction of a city founded on ideals of liberty that nonetheless held thousands in bondage was woven into the fabric of daily life. The gradual emancipation of enslaved people in New York would not begin until 1799, and full abolition would not come until 1827. Catherine Ferguson would spend nearly her entire childhood and adolescence as property, her freedom dependent on the goodwill of others rather than any inherent right. This was the legal and social reality that shaped her early years. The details of those earliest years are sparse, as they are for nearly all people who were born into bondage. Historical records were not kept for the enslaved the way they were kept for free citizens. Birth certificates did not exist. Family trees were not maintained. But what we know about Catherine Ferguson comes from a single extended interview she gave late in her life, when the abolitionist reformer Lewis Tappan sat down with her on March 25, 1850, just 4 years before her death. That conversation, transformed into an obituary and published in the New York Daily Tribune, became the foundation for everything historians would later write about this remarkable woman. When Catherine arrived in New York City with her mother, they were placed in the household of a man she would only ever identify by his initials, R.B. She refused to name him directly, she said, to prevent embarrassment to his family. R.B. was a Presbyterian elder, a man who sat in church every Sunday professing his Christian faith while simultaneously holding human beings as property. This contradiction, the gap between proclaimed belief and lived practice, would shape Catherine's entire life, though perhaps not in the way one might expect. For the first 8 years of her life, Catherine lived with her mother. Katy Williams taught her daughter what she knew from the Bible, passing down stories of faith even in bondage. The older Katy took her child to church with the family she served, sitting in the gallery with other enslaved people, listening to sermons about salvation and redemption. It was in these early years that the seeds of Catherine's own faith were planted. But those years came to an abrupt and devastating end when Catherine was just 8 years old. In 1787, or perhaps 1779, depending on which birth year is accurate, Catherine's mother was sold. The scene that Catherine described to Lewis Tappan more than 60 years later remained vivid in her memory. Before they were torn asunder, she recalled, her mother knelt down, laid her hand on Catherine's head, and gave her to God. It was a blessing, a consecration, and a farewell all at once. Catherine never saw her mother again. That moment of separation became the defining experience of Catherine's life. The anguish of losing her mother, she later explained, made her feel compassion for children. The pain she endured at age 8 would fuel decades of service to abandoned and neglected young people. Where others might have become bitter, Catherine channeled her suffering into empathy. Where others might have closed their hearts, she opened hers wider. After her mother was sold, Catherine took over many of her mother's duties in the RB household. She cared for the family's children and performed general housework. Her mistress told her that if she was as good as her mother, she would do well. But the mistress had no intention of treating Catherine well in return. When Catherine expressed a desire to learn to read, the woman refused, declaring that the enslaved girl already knew more than her own daughters. One of the family's sons later confirmed this assessment. He asked Catherine to help him with his geography and catechism lessons, and when she protested that she could not read, he replied that she certainly seemed to know when he got something wrong. If he misquoted the Bible or stumbled over his catechism, Catherine was quick to correct him. This was the peculiar situation of Catherine Ferguson. She was denied literacy, yet she possessed a remarkable memory that allowed her to store away vast amounts of scripture and religious teaching. She could not read the words on a page, but she could recite them from memory with precision. This ability would later become the foundation of her life's work. At the age of 10, Catherine approached her master with an extraordinary proposal. If he would give her her liberty, she promised, she would serve the Lord forever. It was a bold request from a child, an attempt to bargain for freedom using the only currency she possessed, her faith and her future devotion. R.B. refused. Whatever his Christian convictions might have been on Sunday morning, they did not extend to freeing his property. Catherine waited. She continued to work in the household, attending to her duties while nurturing her inner life. At the age of 12, she began accompanying the older children in the family to their catechism classes at the Presbyterian Church. The teacher allowed her to sit in the back and listen. It was there, absorbing the teachings of the church, that Catherine's faith deepened from childhood belief into adult conviction. When Catherine was 14 years old, she made a decision that would change her life. She decided to seek out the Reverend Dr. John Mitchell Mason, the pastor of the Scotch Presbyterian Church, to talk to him about her soul. This was no small thing. Mason was a prominent minister who had just taken over the pastoral charge of the church after the death of his father. He was a white man of standing and influence. Catherine was an enslaved teenager with no standing at all. Years later, Catherine described that moment to Lewis Tappan with remarkable clarity. She was tremblingly apprehensive, she said, worried that her master's family would find out that she was attending his church or seeking to speak with him. But she summoned resolution enough to go. She rang the doorbell at Dr. Mason's home, and when he opened the door, she was trembling from head to toe, terrified that he would send her away or speak to her harshly. Dr. Mason did no such thing. Instead, he asked her a simple question. "Have you come here to talk to me about your soul?" Feeling greatly encouraged, Catherine entered his home and, as she put it, disclosed to the venerable man the secrets of her heart. Following a period of instruction, she was baptized and became a communicant member of the church. She was, by all accounts, the first person of color to join the congregation. The significance of this moment should not be understated. In late 18th century New York, racism was so pervasive that many white Christians could not conceive of sharing communion with a black person. On Catherine's first communion Sunday, after her reception into the church, some members of the congregation objected to her presence at the Lord's table. Dr. Mason, to his credit, would have none of it. According to one account, as Catherine entered the church that day, the minister met her and took her by the hand, leading her to a seat in his own pew and having the elements brought to her there. It was a public rebuke of prejudice and a powerful statement of inclusion. Catherine remained enslaved, but she had found a spiritual home, and she continued to wait for the freedom she had requested at age 10. That freedom finally came when she was about 16 or 17 years old through the intervention of a remarkable woman named Isabella Graham. Isabella Graham was a Scottish immigrant who had come to New York in 1789, a widow supporting herself and her children by running a private school for girls. She was deeply devout, a member of the same Associate Reformed Presbyterian denomination that Catherine had joined, and she would go on to become one of the most influential philanthropists in American history. Graham founded or helped found multiple charitable organizations, including the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows with Small Children, one of the first female-led charities in the United States. She was, in many ways, a pioneer of organized benevolence in the New Republic. Graham purchased Catherine's freedom for $200, a substantial sum at the time. The original agreement required Catherine to repay the amount over 6 years, but the arrangement was later modified. Instead of monetary repayment, Catherine would work for Graham for 11 months, the equivalent of $100. The remaining $100 was raised by D.V. Bethune, Graham's son-in-law, a prosperous New York merchant who shared his mother-in-law's charitable inclinations. Catherine Ferguson was finally free. She was approximately 17 years old, and for the first time in her life, she owned herself. The question now was what she would do with that freedom. Her first priority was economic independence. Catherine became a baker, specializing in cakes for weddings and parties. By all accounts, she excelled at her craft. Her cakes became famous throughout the city, so renowned that she did not need to advertise. When Lewis Tappan wrote her obituary decades later, he noted that thousands in this community have heard of or known Katy Ferguson, the aged colored woman who, in more vigorous life, was the celebrated cake maker for weddings and other social parties. Her reputation preceded her. The cake business was more than just a livelihood for Catherine. It gave her independence and agency in a world that denied both to black women. She owned her own labor for the first time in her life. She could decide how to spend her time, where to live, and what to do with the money she earned. She chose to invest that freedom in service to others, using her earnings to fund her charitable work rather than accumulating wealth for herself. The cakes she baked for wealthy New Yorkers' celebrations became the means by which she fed hungry children. At the age of 18, Catherine married. Her husband's name was John Ferguson, and from this point forward, the former Katy Williams would be known as Catherine Ferguson, or, more commonly, Katy Ferguson. The marriage was a source of joy, but it would also bring profound sorrow. Catherine bore 2 children, and both died in infancy. Her husband died around the same time, leaving her a widow before she was 20 years old. The deaths of her children were devastating losses that would have broken many people. The infant mortality rate in late 18th century New York was horrifyingly high, and poor families suffered disproportionately from diseases that swept through crowded neighborhoods. Catherine watched both of her babies die, one after the other, unable to save them despite her love and care. And then her husband was gone too, leaving her alone in a city that offered few protections to a young black widow, with no family and no fortune. The loss of her children might have crushed a lesser person. but Catherine's response to grief was to extend her maternal care outward, to embrace children who had no one else to care for them. The pain of losing her own babies, combined with the remembered anguish of being separated from her mother, created in her a fierce commitment to helping neglected and abandoned young people. Sometime in the early 1790s, Catherine began gathering children from her neighborhood on Sundays. She lived on Warren Street in Lower Manhattan, in an area populated by both free black families and poor white immigrants. The children she encountered were often neglected, running wild in the streets while their parents worked or drank or simply did not care. Catherine brought these children to her modest home and organized what would become known as a Sunday school. The term Sunday school requires some explanation for modern readers. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Sunday schools were not simply places where children learned Bible stories before attending regular church services. They were often the only form of education available to the poor. Sunday was the one day of the week when working children were not laboring in factories or workshops, and Sunday schools filled that gap by teaching reading, writing, and religious instruction all at once. They were, in essence, charitable schools for those who could not afford any other education. The Sunday school movement had begun in England in the 1780s, pioneered by figures like Robert Raikes, who sought to provide education and moral instruction to children who worked 6 days a week in factories and had no other opportunity for schooling. The movement spread rapidly to America, where it found fertile ground among evangelical Christians who saw education as a tool for both moral improvement and social uplift. By the time Catherine Ferguson began her work, Sunday schools were proliferating across the young nation, though they remained controversial in some quarters. Some ministers resented lay people, especially women and black people, teaching religious material that they believed should be the exclusive province of ordained clergy. Catherine's Sunday school existed at the intersection of multiple revolutionary changes in American society. The new republic was grappling with questions of citizenship, education, and who belonged in the national community. Evangelical Christianity was sweeping the country in what historians call the Second Great Awakening, emphasizing personal conversion and the responsibility of believers to improve society. Women were beginning to carve out public roles for themselves through charitable work, even as they remained excluded from formal political participation. And free black communities in northern cities were establishing their own institutions, including churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. Catherine Ferguson's work touched all of these currents. Catherine's Sunday school was remarkable for several reasons. First, it was interracial. She welcomed children regardless of their color, teaching black and white children side by side at a time when segregation was the norm. Of the 48 children she would eventually take under her care over the course of her life, 20 of them were white. Second, her school addressed not just the spiritual needs of children, but their physical and material needs as well. She fed hungry children, clothed those who needed clothing, and when she could not care for a child herself, she worked to find them suitable homes with families who could. Third, and perhaps most remarkably, Catherine ran her Sunday school despite being illiterate herself. She could not read the Bible, but she had committed vast portions of it to memory. She knew the catechism by heart. She could recite scripture and hymns with precision. When she needed help with actual reading instruction, she recruited others, including Isabella Graham herself, who would come to Catherine's home to hear the children recite their lessons and receive religious instruction. The Sunday school grew. Word spread through the neighborhood about the black woman who took in children off the streets and taught them about God. Dr. John Mitchell Mason, Catherine's pastor, heard about her work and was deeply impressed. Around 1814, he offered her space in the basement of his new church on Murray Street. There was a lecture room there, he said, where she could hold her classes. The school became known as the Murray Street Sabbath School, and it is often cited as the first Sunday school in New York City. This claim requires some qualification. Other Sunday schools existed in New York during this period. Isabella Graham and her daughter Joanna Bethune had started their own religious instruction programs. Various churches had organized Sabbath classes for children. The precise question of who established the very first Sunday school is difficult to answer definitively. But what is clear is that Catherine Ferguson was a pioneer, one of the earliest and most dedicated practitioners of Sunday school education in the city, and her work predated many of the more formally organized efforts that would follow. Catherine's approach to education was holistic in a way that was unusual for her time. She did not simply teach children on Sunday mornings and send them back to the streets. She became personally invested in their welfare. When she encountered a child in need, she took that child home. She fed them from her own table, clothed them from her own resources, and worked to place them in situations where they could thrive. Her small house on Warren Street became a refuge for the desperate and the abandoned. The children who came to Catherine came from all circumstances. Some were orphans whose parents had died of disease in a city where epidemics regularly swept through the crowded neighborhoods. Others were abandoned by parents who could not or would not care for them. Still, others came from families so poor that they could not feed all their children. Families where the choice was between keeping a child and watching them starve. Catherine took them all, making no distinctions based on race or background. Her methods were simple but effective. She gathered the children on Sunday mornings and led them through catechism and scripture lessons, relying on her prodigious memory to guide them through passages she could not read herself. She recruited literate volunteers to help with actual reading instruction. Isabella Graham and other ladies from the church would visit to hear the children recite their lessons. Catherine fed the children from her own kitchen, using the proceeds from her cake business to purchase food. And when a child needed more permanent care than she could provide, she worked her networks to find placement with suitable families. In addition to her Sunday school work, Catherine held prayer meetings twice a week for both children and adults. She continued this practice for over 40 years, in every neighborhood where she lived. Her influence extended far beyond the children she taught directly. She became a spiritual anchor for her community, a source of guidance and comfort for people of all ages. These prayer meetings were remarkable gatherings that brought together people from different backgrounds and circumstances. The poor and the struggling found in Catherine's home a place of welcome and acceptance. She prayed with them, counseled them, and offered practical help when she could. Her faith was not abstract or theoretical. It was lived out in daily acts of kindness and service. When someone was sick, she visited them. When someone was hungry, she fed them. When someone was grieving, she sat with them. This was the religion she practiced, the faith her mother had planted in her before they were torn apart. The parallel between Catherine Ferguson and her benefactor Isabella Graham is striking and worth examining. Both women were deeply religious. Both channeled their faith into practical charity. Both focused particularly on the needs of women and children. Graham worked through formal organizations, founding societies with constitutions and boards of directors and official missions. Catherine worked informally, out of her own home, with no institutional structure to support her. Graham was wealthy, white, educated, and connected to the highest levels of New York society. Catherine was poor, black, illiterate, and a former slave. Yet the two women collaborated, with Graham and other prominent white reformers supporting Catherine's work among the poor. This collaboration across racial lines was unusual for the period, and speaks to something important about both women. For Graham, it demonstrated a willingness to recognize spiritual gifts and charitable work regardless of the race or social status of the person performing them. For Catherine, it demonstrated a capacity to work with people who had far more power and privilege than she did without losing her own voice or agency. The relationship was not one of equals, but it was one of mutual respect. Catherine's charitable work was financed entirely by her own labor. She made cakes and sold them, and the money she earned went to feeding and clothing the children she took in. When Lewis Tappan asked her, late in her life, whether she had laid up any property, she replied quickly. "How could I," she said, "when I gave away all I earned?" This was not false modesty or self-deprecation. It was a simple statement of fact. Catherine Ferguson chose poverty for herself so that others might have enough. Her generosity was not limited to her Sunday school work. In 1835, a group of prominent white men in New York City took up a collection to purchase the freedom of an enslaved man named Jack, a fugitive who had been imprisoned. The donors' names were published in the newspapers, and among them was a single woman's name, Catherine Ferguson. Hers was a modest contribution compared to the wealthy merchants and professionals who gave larger sums. But it was her own money, earned through her own labor, given freely to help a fellow black person gain the freedom she herself had once been denied. By the 1850s, Catherine Ferguson had become something of a local legend. She had lived in New York for more than 7 decades, watching the city transform from a small seaport town recovering from the devastation of the Revolutionary War into a booming metropolis of hundreds of thousands. She had seen the gradual abolition of slavery in New York State, which was completed in 1827. She had witnessed the rise of the abolitionist movement and the growing national conflict over slavery that would eventually lead to civil war. Through it all, she continued her work, teaching children, holding prayer meetings, caring for the poor. The New York City of Catherine's later years bore little resemblance to the one she had known as a young woman. The population had exploded, driven by waves of immigration from Ireland, Germany, and other European countries. Neighborhoods that had once been quiet residential areas were now teeming tenements. The gap between rich and poor had widened dramatically. Disease, crime, and poverty were endemic in many areas. Yet Catherine continued her work, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining her core mission of serving children in need. The charitable landscape had changed as well. The informal, personal approach that Catherine represented was giving way to more institutionalized forms of benevolence. Large organizations with professional staff were taking over functions that had once been performed by individuals like her. The Children's Aid Society, for example, would be founded in 1853, just a year before Catherine's death, and would pioneer new approaches to child welfare that would spread across the nation. But Catherine continued in her own way, visiting the sick, feeding the hungry, teaching the children who came to her door. In 1850, Lewis Tappan, the prominent abolitionist and evangelical reformer, arranged to interview Catherine for a record of her life. Tappan was a careful man, a businessman whose firm specialized in establishing credit ratings, and he was known for his meticulous documentation. The interview took place on March 25, 1850, and Tappan recorded Catherine's reminiscences in detail. He also arranged for a daguerreotype portrait to be made of her, capturing her image for posterity. His brother Louis kept the portrait. By this time, Catherine was elderly and somewhat infirm, but her mind remained sharp. She spoke to Tappan about her childhood, her mother's blessing before their separation, her conversion, her freedom, her marriage, her losses, and her decades of work with children. She also expressed interest in the American Missionary Association, which Tappan had helped found, and in the missionaries who traveled to Africa. Her concern for others extended to people she would never meet, across an ocean she would never cross. On a Tuesday morning in July 1854, Catherine Ferguson, who had been somewhat indisposed for several days, went out to see a physician. She returned home and lay down, but her condition deteriorated rapidly. Within hours it became clear that she had contracted cholera, a disease that was epidemic in New York that summer. Catherine understood that she was dying. Despite the suddenness of the summons, she was ready. Her mind was calm and clear. A friend stood near her bedside, and Catherine spoke to her with the peace of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. "Oh," she said, "what a good thing it is to have a hope in Jesus." Her final words, before she slipped away, were simple and complete. All is well. Catherine Ferguson died on July 11, 1854. She was approximately 75 years old, though her exact age, like so much else about her early life, remained uncertain. The New York Times published a notice of her death on July 13th, the same day as her funeral. A week later, Louis Tappan published his full obituary in the New York Daily Tribune, and it was subsequently reprinted in newspapers across the country. The timing of her death gave it added poignancy. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made the legal situation for Black Americans more precarious than ever, requiring that escaped slaves be returned to their owners even from free states. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had reignited the national debate over slavery's expansion. The country was sliding toward civil war, and the future for Black Americans, whether free or enslaved, was deeply uncertain. Catherine died at a moment when the cause to which she had contributed her modest donation for Jack's freedom was reaching its crisis point. The day after Tappan published his obituary, he made an entry in his journal that reveals something of the esteem in which Catherine was held by her community. He went to her late residence to look over a barrel of pamphlets she had left. Religious tracts, missionary publications, educational materials. These were the tools of her trade, collected over decades of teaching and ministering to others. While he was there, a little girl from the neighborhood came in and made a simple request. "Please give me a book to remember Aunt Katy by." Tappan gave her a small book. That little girl, unnamed in Tappan's journal, represents the countless lives Catherine touched over her decades of service. We do not know what happened to her or to any of the other children Catherine helped raise and educate. Their stories are lost to history, as so many stories are. But we know they existed. We know that Catherine fed them, clothed them, taught them, and found them homes when they had none. We know that she changed the aspect of every neighborhood where she lived. And we know that at least one little girl wanted something to remember her by. Catherine Ferguson's legacy extended far beyond her death. In 1855, the historian Benson J. Lossing included her among 330 notable Americans in his book, Our Countrymen, or Brief Memoirs of Eminent Americans. The book was reprinted multiple times over the following decades, keeping her memory alive for new generations of readers. The American Tract Society published her life story under the title Katy Ferguson, or What a Poor Colored Woman May Do. Religious periodicals continued to tell her story throughout the 19th century. In 1920, the renowned black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois listed Catherine Ferguson among the most notable colored women of importance, placing her alongside figures who remain household names today: Phyllis Wheatley, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. In his book Darkwater, Du Bois wrote that Kate Ferguson was born in New York, and that freed, widowed, and bereaved of her children before she was 20, she took the children of the streets of New York, white and black, to her empty arms, taught them, found them homes. His summary captured the essence of her life, the transformation of personal loss into public service. In 1920, the Katy Ferguson Home for Unwed Mothers was established in New York City in her honor, providing shelter and support for vulnerable women and their children. The home operated for more than 3 decades, extending Catherine's ministry of care into the 20th century. It served young women who found themselves in circumstances similar to the children Catherine had helped, alone and struggling, and in need of someone to believe in them. In Detroit, Michigan, the Catherine Ferguson Academy was established in 1986 as a public school for teenage mothers and pregnant students. The school operated until 2014, when budget cuts forced its closure. For nearly 30 years, it carried Catherine's name and her mission, providing education and support for young women in difficult circumstances. In 2023, the Alexander Robertson School in New York, which traces its roots to Catherine's Sunday School, petitioned to have 95th Street between Central Park West and Columbus Avenue renamed in her honor. The effort recognized what Lewis Tappan had observed nearly 2 centuries earlier, that wherever Katy lived, the whole aspect of the neighborhood was changed. What are we to make of Catherine Ferguson today? She left no written records of her own because she could not write. Almost everything we know about her comes from the accounts of white reformers like Lewis Tappan, who had their own agendas and perspectives. We cannot hear her voice directly, only through the filter of those who chose to tell her story. This is the challenge of recovering the histories of enslaved and formerly enslaved people. The archives were not designed to preserve their voices. There is also a danger in the way her story has been told. The narrative of the pious, selfless black woman who serves others without complaint can be used to diminish the demands for justice and equality that other black activists were making during the same period. Catherine Ferguson did not, so far as we know, march in protests or write pamphlets demanding abolition or equal rights. She worked within the system as it existed, accepting the patronage of wealthy white women and the approval of white ministers. Some might see this as accommodation to oppression rather than resistance to it. But this interpretation misses something important. Catherine Ferguson did not have the luxury of choosing between accommodation and resistance in any simple way. She was a black woman in a society that denied black women any power. She was illiterate in a world that valued literacy. She was poor in a city increasingly defined by the gap between rich and poor. Within these constraints, she carved out a space for agency and meaning. She built something: her Sunday school, her prayer meetings, her network of care for abandoned children. And she did it on her own terms, in her own way. Yet certain things seem clear. Catherine Ferguson took the trauma of her early life, the separation from her mother, the denial of her freedom, the deaths of her children and transformed it into a life of extraordinary service. She did not wait for institutions to help the poor and neglected children of her neighborhood. She did the work herself, out of her own home, with her own resources, asking nothing in return except the opportunity to serve. She crossed racial boundaries at a time when such crossings were rare and dangerous. She taught black and white children together, in her home and in the church basement, treating all children as equally deserving of education and care. She collaborated with wealthy white philanthropists while maintaining her own independence and agency. She gave to causes beyond her immediate community, contributing to the freedom of enslaved strangers because she remembered what it was to be enslaved herself. Perhaps most remarkably, Catherine Ferguson did all of this without the tool that most educators consider essential: literacy. She could not read, but she could teach. She could not write, but she could pray. She could not sign her own name, but she could transform the lives of 48 children who might otherwise have been lost to the streets. Her limitations did not define her. Her compassion did. The secret of Katy's usefulness, Lewis Tappan wrote, was her fervent, uniform, and consistent piety. No one could be with her, even for a little while, without feeling its influence. The love of God was shed abroad in her heart, and it found expression in acts of benevolence to his children. This was not the piety of Sunday mornings only, the kind practiced by men like R.B., who could own slaves and sit in church without apparent contradiction. This was the piety of everyday life, of getting up each morning and asking how she might serve, of giving away everything she earned so that others might have enough. In an era when slavery was still legal in much of the country, when Black Americans were denied the most basic rights of citizenship, when a woman of color could be bought and sold like property, Catherine Ferguson carved out a space of dignity and purpose. She could not change the laws. She could not overthrow the system, but she could feed hungry children and teach them to pray. She could give them hope when the world gave them none. Her final words echo across the centuries. All is well. It was not a denial of the suffering she had endured, or the injustices she had witnessed. It was an affirmation of a life lived with purpose, a declaration that despite everything, she had found peace. She had been given to God by her mother on the day they were torn apart, and she had spent the rest of her life trying to live up to that gift. Catherine Ferguson, the baby born on a slave ship, the child separated from her mother, the woman denied literacy, the widow who lost her own babies became a mother to 48 children who had no one else. She was the celebrated cake maker of New York City, the founder of one of its first Sunday schools, a woman whose name was known to thousands even though she could not write it herself. Where Katy lived, the whole aspect of the neighborhood was changed. That is her legacy. That is her story. And that is why, nearly 200 years after her death, we remember Catherine Katy Ferguson,